Kate Reyes had not fired a weapon in 6 years, and she intended to keep it that way for the rest of her life, right up until the moment that intentions stopped mattering entirely. Before Antarctica, before the ice, she had been a combat medic attached to a marine rifle company, the kind of job that taught a person more about the human body than any medical school ever could, because a medical school did not teach you what a body looked like torn open on a dirt road at 2 in the morning with men screaming your name for help you did not always have the power to give. She had been good at her job. Good enough that command kept extending her deployments, good enough that her squad started calling her Doc with the kind of easy trust soldiers only give someone they believe can keep them alive. She had kept most of them alive. Not all of them. The mission that ended her career had a name in official reports, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not been there. To Kate it had a different name, one she never said aloud to anyone, not to the therapist the Corps sent her to afterward, not to her sister, not to anyone. It had a name built out of the sounds 6 men made in the last 30 seconds of their lives, and out of her own hands working uselessly against wounds that had already decided the outcome long before she reached them. She left the Marines 18 months later with a chest full of medals she kept in a drawer and never looked at, and a quiet, permanent conviction that she was done with places where people depended on her to keep them alive. Antarctica, she had told herself when the job posting came across her screen 2 years later, was about as far from that conviction as a person could get without leaving the planet. The posting had been for a station medic and general safety officer at a research facility called Halcyon Station, a mid-sized scientific outpost on the edge of the West Antarctic ice sheet, staffed year-round by a rotating crew of glaciologists, engineers, and support staff conducting deep ice core research. The pay was good. The isolation was better. Kate had imagined, applying for the position, a quiet posting full of routine physicals and the occasional frostbite case, months of silence and snow standing between herself and the noise she still carried inside her head. For the first 4 months, that was exactly what it had been. She arrived at Halcyon in the brief window of the Antarctic summer, when the sun did not fully set and the station's small runway could still accept supply flights before the deepening cold sealed the continent off from the rest of the world for the long polar winter. The station itself sat on stilts above the ice, a cluster of connected modules painted the same faded orange as every research outpost Kate had ever seen photographs of, functional rather than beautiful, built to survive rather than to impress anyone. She met the crew in pieces over her first week, the way a person meets any new workplace, names and faces sorting themselves slowly into people she would come to know well over the coming months. Commander Bill Ashworth ran the station with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had spent 3 previous winters on the ice and had long since stopped being impressed by anything the continent could throw at him. Dr. Sarah Chen led the glaciology team, a sharp, driven woman whose entire career had been building toward the deep core project the station existed to support. Mike Torres ran the drilling operation, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh who treated the massive drill rig at the heart of the station's mission like a beloved, temperamental pet. Kate liked them all well enough, in the careful, guarded way she had learned to like people since coming home. She did not expect any of them would need saving. The Deep Core project had been running for 3 years by the time Kate arrived, a slow, patient effort to drill down through nearly 3 kilometers of ancient ice to reach bedrock that had not seen open air in over 100,000 years. Sarah Chen explained the science to Kate over dinner one night early in her posting, her eyes bright with the particular enthusiasm of a scientist finally closing in on a career-defining result, describing layers of ice like pages in a book, each one recording centuries of climate history compressed into ice cores no wider than a dinner plate. "We are close," Sarah told her that night, pushing reheated station food around her plate without really eating it. "Another few weeks, maybe a month, and we hit bedrock. Nobody has ever pulled a continuous core this deep in this part of the ice sheet. It is going to rewrite half of what we think we know about the last ice age." Kate had nodded along politely, more interested that week in getting the station's medical inventory properly organized than in the details of ancient climate data, though she found herself, over the following weeks, drawn increasingly into the quiet excitement building among the science staff as the drill crept closer and closer to its target depth. Mike Torres ran the drill in careful, monitored shifts, the great mechanical arm grinding its way downward meter by meter through ice that had been forming since long before any human civilization had existed to record it. The work was slow and mostly uneventful, the kind of steady grinding progress that made for good routine but poor drama, and Kate settled comfortably into the rhythm of station life, treating the occasional twisted ankle or bout of cabin fever, running her daily rounds, and mostly, blessedly, being left alone with the quiet in her own head. That quiet ended on a Tuesday in early March, 3 weeks before the polar winter would seal them all in completely, when Mike Torres's drill stopped grinding through ice and struck something else entirely. The alarm that went up from the drill control room was not the kind of alarm anyone at Halcyon Station had heard before, a strange, uncertain call over the radio from Mike Torres that carried none of his usual easy confidence. "I need Sarah and the commander down here," Mike said, his voice tight in a way that pulled every head in the mess hall up from their meals. "We hit something. It is not bedrock." Kate followed the small crowd that gathered at the drill control room out of simple curiosity more than any sense that this concerned her directly, and she found Mike Torres staring at his monitors with an expression she recognized from her time overseas, the particular stillness of a person whose instincts had just told them something was wrong before their conscious mind had caught up to why. "Drill hit resistance about 200 meters short of our target bedrock depth," Mike explained once Sarah and Commander Ashworth had crowded in beside him. "Resistance profile does not match rock. It is too uniform, too smooth." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, studying the readout with growing intensity. "Could be a boulder. An erratic caught in the ice sheet, carried down from some ancient glacial movement." "Maybe," Mike said, though his tone made clear he did not believe it. "Except the ground-penetrating radar survey we ran last month should have flagged anything that size sitting in the drill path. It did not flag anything. Whatever this is, it was not there in the survey data, or it was there and the radar could not properly read it." Commander Ashworth studied the readout for a long, silent moment, the easy calm he usually carried noticeably absent from his face. "Pull the drill back," he said finally. "I want eyes on whatever we just hit before we push any further." They ran a second, more focused radar survey over the following 2 days, Sarah and her small science team working around the clock to map whatever lay beneath the drill site with as much precision as their equipment allowed. Kate found herself pulled into the effort almost by accident, helping haul equipment across the ice during the brief hours of daylight remaining before the winter darkness fully descended, and she was present in the control room when the first clear image finally resolved on Sarah's monitor. The room went silent. The shape beneath the ice was not a boulder. It was not any natural formation Sarah or anyone else on her team could account for. It was a structure, geometric and precise, its outline unmistakable even through the distortion of nearly 3 kilometers of ancient ice, for sloped sides rising to a point, sitting in perfect, deliberate symmetry 200 meters below the drill site. "That is a pyramid," someone said from the back of the crowded room, giving voice to the thought every single person present had already arrived at independently and had been too stunned to say aloud. Sarah stared at the image for a long time before she finally spoke again, her voice unsteady in a way Kate had never heard from her before. "The ice at that depth is old. Older than any human civilization we know of. If this structure is embedded in ice that formed 100,000 years ago or more, then whatever built it did not build it recently, and it definitely was not built by anyone we have a name for in any history book." Commander Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, staring at the same image, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful weight of a man already calculating the enormous consequences of whatever decision he made next. "Get command on the satellite line," he said. "They are going to want to know about this before we do anything else." Command's response, when it finally came through 2 days later after what Kate assumed had been a great deal of high-level discussion far above any of their pay grades, was not what most of the station staff had expected. Rather than ordering an immediate halt to all activity pending a full research vessel and specialist team the following summer, the response authorized a small, careful excavation to begin immediately, citing the enormous scientific value of the find and the enormous cost and delay involved in waiting out an entire additional Antarctic winter before returning with proper equipment. Kate did not like the decision, though nobody had asked her opinion. Something about the pace of it, the eagerness with which distant administrators an ocean away were willing to push a small isolated crew toward direct contact with something utterly unprecedented, sat wrong in her gut in a way she recognized from years of watching command decisions made by people who would never personally bear the consequences of being wrong. She kept that opinion mostly to herself, though she voiced a milder version of it to Commander Ashworth over coffee one morning, and found him more sympathetic to the concern than she expected. "I do not love it either," he admitted quietly, glancing around the mostly empty mess hall before continuing. "But my orders are my orders, and there is a whole world of scientific interest riding on this that is bigger than what either of us is comfortable with. What I can do is make sure we go in slow, and go in careful, and pull back the second anything about this feels wrong." Kate appreciated the sentiment, even as some old, hard-won instinct in her chest warned that feeling wrong and being too late to matter often arrived at almost exactly the same moment. The excavation began 3 days later, a careful, methodical effort to widen the drill shaft into something large enough for a person to actually descend, using specialized ice-cutting equipment that Mike Torres operated with a focused intensity Kate had not seen from him before. The work was slow, cautious, every meter of newly cut shaft reinforced and inspected before the crew pushed further downward, and Kate found herself assigned to the excavation team's standby medical support, spending long cold hours at the surface waiting for a call that, for the first several days, never came. Sarah Chen led the scientific side of the effort with barely restrained excitement, running every available sensor down the widening shaft ahead of any human presence, mapping the structure below in increasing detail as the equipment drew closer. The pyramid, as the readings continued to confirm, was enormous, far larger than the initial radar survey had suggested, its base extending outward beneath the ice sheet across an area that dwarfed the entire footprint of Halcyon Station itself. "Whoever built this," Sarah told the assembled crew during one of the nightly briefings Commander Ashworth had instituted to keep the whole station informed of the excavation's progress, "had capabilities we cannot currently explain. The materials do not match anything in our geological surveys of this region. Preliminary composition readings suggest something closer to a dense ceramic alloy than natural stone, engineered rather than quarried." The briefing room, usually loose and informal, had grown steadily quieter and more tense with each passing night as the implications of what they were uncovering settled more deeply into everyone present. Kate watched the faces around her during these briefings, watched excitement mingle uneasily with a growing, unspoken dread that nobody quite wanted to be the first to name aloud. She recognized that particular silence. She had heard it before, in briefing rooms an entire world away, in the quiet hour before something went badly wrong. 10 days into the excavation, the shaft finally reached the outer surface of the structure itself, and Sarah's team lowered a small camera rig down to capture the first direct images anyone had ever taken of the pyramid's exterior. The entire station crowded into the control room to watch the feed come through, nearly 30 people packed shoulder to shoulder around a bank of monitors, and when the camera's lights finally illuminated a section of the ancient surface, a collective breath went out of the room all at once. The material was black, or nearly black, with a faint iridescent sheen that shifted subtly under the camera's lights, smooth in most places but carved, in others, with patterns that made Kate's skin crawl in a way she could not immediately explain. The patterns were not decorative in any sense she recognized. They looked, if anything, functional, arranged in dense repeating clusters that reminded her uncomfortably of circuitry, or of some alien alphabet built from angles rather than curves. "I have never seen anything like this," Sarah said quietly, her earlier excitement now tempered by something closer to genuine awe. "This is not primitive. Whoever made this understood engineering principles we are still catching up to." Commander Ashworth studied the feed for a long moment before speaking. "Any sign of an entrance? Any opening in the structure?" Sarah checked her readouts, then shook her head slowly. "Not visible from this angle. The surface here appears completely sealed. If there is an entrance anywhere, we have not found it yet." Mike Torres, standing near the back of the crowded room, spoke up with a note of caution in his voice that Kate had not heard from him before. "Maybe that is the point. Maybe it is sealed because it is supposed to stay sealed." The room fell quiet again, nobody quite willing to be the one who agreed with him out loud, though Kate suspected most of the people present had already privately arrived at the exact same thought. Command, upon reviewing the images and Sarah's preliminary analysis, authorized a wider excavation to fully expose the visible surface of the structure and locate any possible point of entry, a decision that took another full week of careful, exhausting work to accomplish. Kate spent much of that week at the surface, treating a growing list of minor injuries among the excavation crew, strained backs and frostbitten fingers, and the general accumulated toll of physical labor performed in brutal conditions, and found herself, despite her own reservations, increasingly caught up in the strange electric excitement that had settled over the entire station. It was Priya Anand, one of the station's junior engineers, who finally located what appeared to be an entrance, a narrow seam running along one sloped face of the pyramid that the excavation team's careful clearing work had gradually exposed. The seam was different from the dense geometric patterns covering the rest of the surface, smoother, more deliberate, and when Priya ran a portable scanner along its length, the readings suggested a cavity behind it, an open space where the rest of the structure appeared to be solid. "This has got to be it," Priya reported over the radio, her voice carrying a barely contained excitement that Kate found herself unable to entirely share. "The door. Or something like one." The discovery triggered another round of careful discussion between Commander Ashworth and Command back at headquarters, discussions Kate was not privy to directly but could infer plenty about from the commander's increasingly tired, tense expression over the following days. Whatever pressure was coming down from above, it clearly weighed on him, and when he finally called the full station together to announce the next phase of the operation, his voice carried none of the easy confidence Kate remembered from her first weeks at Halcyon. "We have been authorized to attempt entry," he said simply. "A small team, first thing tomorrow. I want everyone else on standby, full readiness, until we know exactly what we are dealing with down there." Kate volunteered for the entry team before she had fully decided to, the words leaving her mouth in the tense silence following Commander Ashworth's announcement almost before her conscious mind had caught up with the decision. Some old instinct, the same one that had once made her follow squads into buildings she had every reason to fear, pushed the offer out of her before caution could talk her out of it. Ashworth studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing her military background against the obvious risks of what he was asking anyone to volunteer for. "You sure about that, Reyes? If something goes wrong down there," Kate said, "you are going to want someone who has dealt with mass casualties under pressure before, not someone learning that skill for the first time in the moment." "That is me. I am sure." He nodded slowly, accepting the logic even if his expression suggested he did not love it. The final entry team came together over the following hours, 6 people chosen for a careful balance of scientific expertise and practical capability. Sarah Chen, unwilling to miss the discovery of her career despite the obvious risk. Priya Anand, whose engineering knowledge would be essential in navigating whatever they found. Mike Torres, along to handle any structural concerns with the excavated shaft itself. A station security officer named Dozer Franklin, a broad, quiet man with a military background of his own who Kate had liked immediately upon meeting him. Kate herself, carrying a full medical kit and, at Commander Ashworth's insistence, a sidearm she had not touched in 6 years and had hoped never to touch again. And Tobias Lund, a young researcher specializing in ancient materials, eager in the particular way of someone who had not yet learned, the way Kate had learned overseas, exactly how quickly eagerness could turn into regret. They gathered at the shaft entrance the following morning, the Antarctic sky above them already beginning its long slide into the deep winter darkness, and one by one, they began the long descent toward the sealed black door 200 meters beneath the ice. The descent took nearly an hour, the team moving carefully down a series of reinforced ladders and platforms Mike Torres's crew had installed over the preceding weeks, the temperature dropping steadily colder the deeper they went despite the insulated suits each of them wore. Kate kept her breathing steady and even, an old habit from years of moving through hostile buildings, cataloging exits and angles even in a space as straightforward as a vertical shaft, because old habits did not simply disappear because a person wanted them to. The black surface of the pyramid grew larger and more imposing as they descended alongside it, Floodlights rigged along the shaft walls throwing harsh white light across patterns that seemed, the closer Kate got to them, to shift subtly depending on the angle she viewed them from, an effect that made her stomach uneasy in a way she could not fully explain. "You feeling that too?" Dozer Franklin muttered beside her, his voice low enough that only she caught it over the ambient hum of their equipment. "Like something is watching the light move." "Yeah," Kate admitted. "I am feeling that too." They reached the base of the shaft where it met the pyramid's sealed door, a narrow platform Mike's crew had constructed to give the team stable footing at the point of entry. Up close, the seam Priya had identified from her scans was unmistakable, a hairline division running vertically through the smooth black surface, faint traces of the same shifting iridescent pattern visible along its edges. Sarah ran her hand carefully along the seam, her expression a mixture of scientific wonder and something else Kate recognized as a very old, very human fear finally beginning to assert itself despite months of academic excitement. "This is real," Sarah said quietly, almost to herself. "This is actually real." "Let us find out what is on the other side," Priya said, already moving her scanner toward the seam, and Kate found herself, despite every instinct urging caution, leaning in closer to watch. Priya's scanner detected a mechanism embedded within the seam itself, something that responded, faintly but unmistakably, to the proximity of their equipment's electromagnetic field, and after nearly 20 minutes of careful, patient work, a low grinding vibration ran through the black surface beneath their feet, audible even through the insulated soles of their boots. "It is opening," Priya said, her voice tight with a mixture of triumph and fear. "Something in there just responded to us." The seam widened slowly, the two halves of the door retracting into the surrounding structure with a smoothness that seemed impossible given however many thousands of years the mechanism had lain dormant beneath the ice, and a breath of air pushed outward from the opening darkness beyond, air that smelled, faintly but distinctly, of something organic and old, a smell none of them had any reference point for. Dozer raised the tactical light mounted on his weapon and swept it into the widening gap, illuminating a space beyond that made every person on the platform go still with a kind of awe that briefly overrode their fear entirely. The interior of the pyramid was vast, far larger than the exterior dimensions had suggested was possible, a cavernous space extending upward and outward beyond the reach of their lights, its walls lined with the same shifting geometric patterns that covered the exterior, now moving in slow, deliberate waves that suggested something closer to a living surface than a carved one. "That should not be possible," Sarah whispered, staring up into the darkness above them. "The interior volume does not match the exterior dimensions at all. This is bigger inside than it is outside." Kate did not have an answer for that. She simply kept her hand resting lightly on the grip of the sidearm at her hip, an old, unwelcome instinct telling her, with a certainty she could not ignore, that whatever they had just opened, they were not going to like what waited for them inside. They moved into the pyramid's interior in a careful formation Kate found herself organizing almost without conscious thought, old training reasserting itself with an ease that unsettled her nearly as much as the strange space around them. Dozer took point with his weapon light, Kate covering their rear, the three scientists moving carefully between them, cataloging everything their instruments could capture as they advanced deeper into the structure. The interior chamber stretched out before them in dimensions that continued to defy the exterior measurements Sarah's team had recorded, a vast open space whose ceiling their lights could not fully illuminate, its walls curving away into darkness on either side. The moving patterns covering every surface pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, and the deeper they moved into the chamber, the more Kate became convinced the movement was not merely decorative, that it carried some purpose she could not begin to guess at. "There," Priya said suddenly, pointing her light toward the center of the vast chamber, where a raised platform rose from the smooth floor, holding atop it a shape that made every person in the group stop moving at once. It was a sarcophagus, or something close enough to that concept that the word came unbidden to Kate's mind, an elongated container carved from the same black material as the rest of the structure, resting on the raised platform with an unmistakable sense of deliberate purpose, as though the entire vast chamber had been built around this single object. "That is not decoration," Mike Torres said quietly, his usual easy confidence entirely absent from his voice now. "That is a container." Somebody or something put that there on purpose and built this whole place around protecting it. Sarah moved toward it slowly, drawn by the same magnetic scientific curiosity that had brought her this far, and Kate found herself moving to keep pace beside her, every instinct in her body screaming a warning she could not quite translate into words fast enough to stop what happened next. The sarcophagus, once they reached the raised platform and Priya's scanner passed over its surface, registered readings that made no sense against any equipment calibration Priya could account for, a faint, rhythmic pulse of energy emanating from somewhere deep within the container itself, slow and steady in a pattern that reminded Kate, with a growing dread she could not shake, uncomfortably of a heartbeat. "That cannot be right," Priya said, checking her scanner a second time, then a third. "This reading suggests some kind of active biological process. Something inside there is alive." "After 100,000 years," Sarah said, though her voice had lost every trace of its earlier scientific detachment, replaced now by something closer to genuine fear. "That is not possible. Nothing survives dormant that long." "The scanner does not lie," Priya said. "Whatever that reading means, it is real." Dozer had gone very quiet beside Kate, his weapon light sweeping slowly across the chamber's darkened edges, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat, controlled tone of a man doing everything in his power to keep panic out of it. "I think we should call this in and get out of here. Right now. Whatever this reading is, I do not think we are equipped to be standing this close to it." Commander Ashworth's voice crackled over the radio before anyone could respond, relayed down from the surface team monitoring their progress. "Say again, Franklin, what are you reading down there?" Before Dozer could answer, a deep, resonant groan echoed through the vast chamber, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound so low it registered as much through the floor beneath their feet as through their ears, and every light in the pyramid's interior surface flared suddenly bright, the shifting patterns along the walls accelerating into a frantic, pulsing rhythm. The sarcophagus on the platform before them began, slowly and unmistakably, to crack open. "Get back," Kate shouted, her training taking over completely now, shoving Sarah bodily away from the platform as a network of hairline fractures spread rapidly across the sarcophagus surface, accompanied by a hissing release of pressure that fogged the cold air around them with a fine, dark mist. "Everybody back, now move." The team scrambled backward across the chamber floor as the fractures widened, chunks of the black material beginning to fall away from the container's surface, and the low groaning sound that had first announced the disturbance built steadily into something closer to a roar, deep and guttural and unmistakably, horrifyingly alive. Tobias Lund, closest to the platform when the sarcophagus finally shattered outward, did not move fast enough. What emerged from the wreckage of the container was not immediately visible in full, obscured by the dark mist still hanging thick in the chamber's cold air, but Kate caught glimpses in the strobing, frantic light of the pulsing walls, a shape far larger than the sarcophagus should have been able to contain, limbs unfolding in configurations that made her mind rebel against processing what her eyes were actually seeing, a form that seemed built from something between insect and reptile and something else entirely that had no proper name in any language Kate knew. Tobias screamed, a short, high sound cut brutally, horribly short as something moved through the mist too fast for Kate's eyes to fully track, and when the mist cleared enough for her to see clearly, Tobias Lund's body was no longer entirely whole, torn apart with a violence that made even Kate, with all her years of combat medicine, go cold with a horror she had never experienced in quite this way before. "Move," Dozer roared, opening fire into the mist even as he grabbed Priya by the arm and hauled her bodily toward the chamber entrance, and Kate, her medical training screaming at her to help a man who was already, unmistakably, beyond any help she could give, forced herself to turn and run instead, toward the only exit, with the vast dark shape now fully emerged from its ancient prison moving toward them with a speed that defied every instinct telling her something that large should not be able to move that fast. They reached the shaft entrance in a desperate, scrambling rush, Dozer firing steady, controlled bursts behind them that seemed to do nothing more than momentarily slow the creature's advance. Its outer surface, in the brief glimpses Kate caught over her shoulder, deflecting or absorbing the impacts without any visible sign of real damage. Sarah reached the first ladder rung ahead of the others, scrambling upward with a raw, desperate speed that abandoned every trace of her earlier scientific composure. "Climb!" Kate shouted, shoving Priya toward the ladder while she and Dozer covered their retreat. "Go, go, go!" The creature's roar filled the chamber behind them, a sound that seemed to physically press against Kate's chest, and in the strobing light she finally caught a fuller glimpse of the thing that had been sleeping beneath the Antarctic ice for longer than human civilization had existed. A shape easily 3 times the height of a man, its limbs too numerous, too jointed, moving with a horrible fluid coordination that suggested an intelligence behind its violence rather than mere animal instinct. Dozer fired his last magazine into the advancing shape, buying precious seconds, and then he was moving too, both of them scrambling up the ladder after the others, the metal structure shaking violently as something massive struck the shaft wall below them. "Command, this is entry team," Kate shouted into her radio, her voice raw with adrenaline and horror. "We have a hostile contact. Repeat, hostile contact. Lund is down. We need immediate extraction and every armed body you can get to this shaft entrance. Do you copy?" Static answered her for one agonizing second before Commander Ashworth's voice crackled back, sharp with an urgency that matched her own. "Copy that, entry team. Get up here. We are pulling everyone we have to the shaft head right now." Below them, in the vast open chamber, the creature let out a second roar, and this time, unmistakably, it began to climb. The climb back to the surface felt endless, every meter of the ladder a fresh eternity of terror as Kate forced her burning muscles upward, the sound of something massive scraping and tearing its way up the shaft behind them growing steadily closer despite every desperate ounce of speed the team could manage. Mike Torres, ahead of Kate on the ladder, called down a warning as he reached a narrow platform partway up the shaft. "There is a support strut here," he shouted, already working at something with his hands as Kate caught up to him. "If I pull this, it collapses part of the shaft wall behind us, might slow it down, might buy us time." "Do it," Kate said without hesitation, and Mike wrenched the strut free with a grunt of effort that Kate matched a second later, both of them throwing their weight against the reinforced beam until it finally gave way with a shriek of tortured metal, sending a section of the shaft wall collapsing downward in a cascade of ice and debris. The roar that followed from below told Kate the collapse had connected with something, though whether it had actually slowed the creature down or simply enraged it further, she had no way to know, and she did not wait around to find out. She and Mike scrambled the rest of the way up the ladder, catching up to the others just as the surface opening finally came into view above them, a small, blessed circle of gray Antarctic daylight. They emerged from the shaft into a scene of frantic activity, Commander Ashworth directing a hastily assembled group of station personnel armed with whatever weapons the outpost's limited security supplies could provide, and the moment the last of the entry team cleared the shaft opening, Ashworth gave the order Kate hadn't known was coming. "Seal it," he shouted. "Get the emergency cap over that shaft right now." The emergency cap, a heavy reinforced plate designed to protect the shaft opening from surface weather rather than anything resembling what now climbed toward it from below, took nearly 4 agonizing minutes for the station crew to winch into place, every second of that delay stretching Kate's nerves to their absolute limit as she stood at the shaft edge with the rest of the entry team, watching the darkness below for any sign of what was coming. It arrived just as the cap's final locking mechanism engaged, a massive dark shape surging up out of the shaft with a speed that nearly overwhelmed the barrier before it could fully seal, one enormous limb slamming against the underside of the cap hard enough to buckle the reinforced steel, sending station personnel scrambling backward with cries of alarm. "It is not going to hold," Mike Torres shouted, staring at the buckled metal with wide, horrified eyes. "That thing is strong enough to tear straight through that cap if it wants to." Commander Ashworth's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady, the voice of a man forcing calm onto himself through sheer will alone. "Then we do not wait around to find out. Everyone full station lockdown, right now. I want every door sealed, every window reinforced, and I want every weapon we have distributed to anyone trained to use one." The station crew scattered to their assigned emergency stations with the kind of urgent, practiced efficiency that came from drills Kate had assumed, until this exact moment, would never actually be needed in earnest. She found herself swept up in the chaos, her medical training taking over as she began organizing the mess hall into an emergency triage area, her hands moving through familiar motions even as her mind kept circling back, again and again, to the image of that vast dark shape surging up out of the ancient ice with a hunger that felt, somehow, personal. Below them, muffled but unmistakable through the buckled metal cap, the creature roared again, closer now than it had any right to be. The cap held for nearly 6 hours, long enough for Commander Ashworth to organize the station into a defensible posture, weapons distributed among the handful of personnel with any real training in their use. The remaining crew gathered into the most structurally reinforced sections of the facility. Kate spent those 6 hours moving between stations, checking on the injured from the earlier scramble to seal the shaft, running through emergency protocols with anyone who would listen and trying, without much success, to push down the cold certainty building steadily in her chest that 6 hours was not going to be nearly enough time. She was proven right just after midnight, station time, when a tremendous impact shook the entire facility hard enough to knock equipment from shelves and send several crew members stumbling from their feet. The emergency lighting flickered, died, then came back on a moment later powered by the station's backup generators, and over the station's internal radio, a voice Kate recognized as one of the security teams screamed a warning that turned her blood to ice. "It is through the cap, it is through the cap, everybody get to your fallback positions right now." The station erupted into controlled chaos, Commander Ashworth's voice cutting through the panic over the intercom system with clipped, urgent instructions, directing personnel toward the reinforced central module that had been designated, during the earlier hours of preparation, as the facility's primary fallback position. Kate grabbed her medical kit and the sidearm she had been issued and moved toward the central module at a dead run, joining the flow of terrified station personnel converging from every corridor. Behind her, somewhere deeper in the facility, she heard the first screams begin, and she understood, with a sick, sinking certainty, that not everyone was going to make it to the fallback position in time. The thing that had torn its way up through the buckled emergency cap moved through Halcyon Station with a speed and violence that made a mockery of every defensive preparation the crew had managed in their 6 hours of frantic warning. Kate caught only fragmented glimpses of the carnage as she ran, a torn section of corridor wall, a spray of dark blood across a bank of monitors, the crumpled shape of someone she recognized but did not have time to properly identify before the flow of the crowd swept her past. She reached the central module amid a crush of terrified personnel, Commander Ashworth and Dozer Franklin already positioned at the reinforced entrance, directing people through as fast as the narrow doorway allowed while keeping their weapons trained on the corridor beyond. Kate turned to help usher the last of the stragglers through, and it was in that moment, glancing back down the corridor, that she saw it clearly for the first time in full station lighting rather than the strobing, mist-choked chaos of the pyramid's interior. It was worse than her memory of it. Far worse. Its body moved with an insectal, jointed fluidity that seemed to defy the basic mechanics of its own enormous size, dark chitinous plates catching the harsh station lighting in a way that made its true shape difficult to fully register even while looking directly at it, as though some part of Kate's own mind was actively rejecting what it was seeing. Blood, human blood, dark and glistening, coated much of its forward limbs, and as it surged down the corridor toward the module entrance, it let out a sound that was not quite a roar and not quite anything Kate had a proper word for, something that vibrated in her chest and made every hair on her body stand on end. "Seal it now," Ashworth screamed, and Dozer threw his weight against the heavy reinforced door just as the creature reached the threshold, the metal frame groaning under the impact of something on the other side determined, with an intelligence that terrified Kate more than raw animal hunger ever could, to get inside. The reinforced door held, barely, the creature's repeated impacts against its far side sending shudders through the entire module that rattled loose equipment from the walls and left every person crowded inside flinching with each new strike. Kate did a rapid head count once the immediate chaos settled into something resembling order, and the number that came back to her hit harder than she expected, even having braced herself for losses. Of the 32 people stationed at Halcyon, 21 had made it to the central module. 11 had not. And from the brief, horrific glimpses Kate had caught during the desperate run through the corridors, she held little hope that any significant number of those 11 remained alive. Sarah Chen sat against the far wall, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing, the scientific wonder that had defined her for months now replaced entirely by a hollow, shell-shocked silence. Mike Torres moved among the crowd, checking on people with a kind of frantic, useful energy that Kate recognized as a man desperately needing something to do with his hands to keep from thinking too hard about what he had just witnessed. Priya Anand sat near Sarah, her engineering knowledge already turning, even through her own visible shock, toward the practical problem of the door and how long it might realistically hold. Commander Ashworth pulled Kate aside once the initial chaos had settled, his face gray with exhaustion and grief. He clearly had no time to properly feel yet. "I need your read on this, Reyes. Military experience. What are we actually dealing with here, and what is our real play?" Kate thought of the vast dark shape moving through the corridor with terrible intelligent purpose, thought of the way it had seemed to specifically hunt rather than simply rampage, and felt the old, familiar weight of command-level decisions settling onto her shoulders in a way she had sworn, 6 years ago, she would never carry again. "We are dealing with something smart," she said finally, "which means we cannot just hide from it forever. Eventually it is going to find a way through that door, or find another way in entirely. We need a plan beyond just waiting to die in here." The impacts against the door continued sporadically through the following hour, sometimes a single heavy strike, sometimes a sustained battering that made everyone in the module go rigid with fear, and in between those assaults, the crowded survivors began, slowly and painfully, to organize themselves into something resembling a functional group rather than simply a mass of terrified people. Kate moved among them, checking injuries, most minor, cuts and bruises from the frantic scramble to reach safety, though a young researcher named Elena Voss had a badly broken arm from a fall during the evacuation that Kate splinted as best she could with the limited supplies she had managed to grab on her way through the chaos. As she worked, she listened to the fragments of conversations swirling around her, survivors piecing together, in halting, traumatized voices, what they had witnessed during the initial breach. The picture that emerged was worse than Kate had allowed herself to fully imagine. The creature had moved through the facility's outer corridors with terrible speed, and the death toll among those who had not reached the central module in time appeared to be total. Names were spoken quietly, checked against the growing list of the missing, and each confirmation landed on the crowded room like another physical blow. Dozer Franklin, still stationed at the door with the last of the station's functional weapons, called Kate over quietly partway through her work. "I have got maybe 40 rounds left between everyone's weapons combined," he told her, keeping his voice low enough that the words would not carry to the wider room and further deepen the panic already simmering beneath the surface. That thing shrugged off a full magazine back at the pyramid entrance without so much as slowing down. "I do not think we are shooting our way out of this document." Kate had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone with Dozer's clear tactical experience settled the fear more solidly in her chest. If they could not fight their way out, they needed another option entirely, and she had no idea yet what that option might be. It was Priya Anand who first raised the possibility that would eventually shape everything the survivors did over the following desperate hours, approaching Kate and Commander Ashworth with her tablet in hand and an expression that mixed fear with the sharp, focused clarity of an engineer's mind working a problem under pressure. "The station's backup generator room sits about 40 meters from here, connected by a maintenance corridor," Priya explained, pulling up a schematic of the facility on her screen. "That generator room also houses the fuel reserves for the entire station, several thousand liters of aviation fuel we keep on hand for the supply flights and vehicle operations. If we could lure that thing into the generator room and ignite those reserves, the resulting explosion might be enough to actually hurt it. Might even kill it outright, depending on what it actually is under that armor." "Might," Commander Ashworth repeated grimly. "That is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Anand." "It is the best idea anyone in this room has had in the last hour," Priya shot back, some of her usual sharp confidence returning despite the horror around them. "Unless somebody else has got a better plan for actually stopping this thing rather than just delaying the inevitable." Nobody did. Kate turned the idea over in her own mind, drawing on old training that had once required her to think through exactly this kind of desperate, high-risk tactical problem, and found herself, despite every reasonable fear screaming against it, nodding slowly. "We would need bait," she said. "Something to draw it into the generator room and keep it there long enough for someone to trigger the ignition and get clear. That is not a job I can ask for a volunteer for. That is a job somebody has to choose to do knowing exactly what it might cost them." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, every person present understanding exactly what Kate had just said, and exactly what it might mean for whoever eventually stepped forward. Mike Torres broke the silence first, his voice steadier than Kate expected given the weight of what he was about to volunteer for. "I know that generator room better than anybody else in this station. Spent half my first winter here just learning its systems inside and out. If anybody has got a real shot at surviving long enough in there to trigger the ignition and get out the emergency hatch on the far side, it is probably me." "Mike," Sarah started, her voice cracking, but he shook his head before she could finish whatever protest she had been building toward. "I am not saying I want to do this," he said quietly. "I am saying somebody has got to, and I am the best equipped person in this room to actually pull it off and live. That is not heroics, Sarah, that is just math." Commander Ashworth studied him for a long moment before finally nodding, the decision clearly costing him something significant even as he accepted its brutal necessity. "All right, we do this together. Reyes, Franklin, you are with Torres for the approach. Cover him and buy him whatever time you can. The rest of us hold this position and prepare to move the second that generator room goes up, in case the explosion does not fully finish the job and we need to be ready to run." Kate felt the old, familiar weight of a mission briefing settle over her, the specific tightening focus that had once defined years of her life overseas, and found, to her own surprise, that some deeply buried part of her almost welcomed it, the clarity of purpose cutting through the raw terror in a way that almost made the fear manageable. "Give me 5 minutes to get everyone squared away here," she said, "and then let us go kill this thing." The maintenance corridor leading toward the generator room ran narrow and poorly lit, emergency lighting casting everything in a dim red glow that did nothing to ease the tension coiled tight in Kate's chest as she moved forward alongside Dozer and Mike, weapon raised, every sense straining for any sign that the creature had already found its way into this section of the facility ahead of them. They moved in careful, practiced formation, the kind of movement Kate had not performed in 6 years but which her body remembered with a fluency that surprised her, muscle memory reasserting itself with an ease that felt almost like relief after months of deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of readiness. Dozer took point, his own military background evident in every controlled, economical movement, while Mike followed close behind with the small ignition device Priya had rigged from spare electronics, and Kate covered their rear, watching the darkness behind them with a wariness born of hard experience. They were perhaps 20 meters from the generator room's entrance when the corridor lighting flickered violently, and a sound reached them from somewhere ahead, a low, wet clicking that raised every hair on Kate's body. "Contact ahead," Dozer whispered, freezing in place, his weapon light sweeping the corridor's darkened depths. The creature emerged from a side passage Kate had not accounted for in Priya's schematic, its massive form somehow folding itself through a gap that seemed impossibly narrow for its size, and for one horrible, frozen second, all three of them stood face to face with the thing that had already torn through half their station's crew. "Run!" Kate shouted, and the corridor exploded into chaos. Dozer opened fire immediately, the narrow corridor amplifying the gunshots into a deafening roar, and the creature recoiled slightly under the impacts before surging forward with renewed fury, one massive limb sweeping through the space where Dozer had been standing a half-second earlier, close enough that Kate felt the displaced air against her own face as she threw herself sideways into a maintenance alcove. "The generator room, go!" Dozer shouted, backing away from the creature while continuing to fire, buying precious seconds for Mike to scramble past the immediate danger toward the entrance still another 15 meters ahead. Kate scrambled up from the alcove and added her own weapon to the defense, aiming for the thing's joints where the chitinous plating seemed thinner, less protected, and was rewarded with a piercing shriek that suggested, for the first time since this nightmare began, that the creature was not entirely invulnerable after all. It turned its attention toward her with terrifying speed, and Kate barely managed to dive clear of a strike that tore a deep gouge into the metal wall where she had been standing a heartbeat earlier, the force of the impact alone enough to leave her ears ringing. "Raise, move," Dozer roared, and Kate scrambled to her feet and ran, following Mike's path toward the generator room while Dozer continued firing behind her, drawing the creature's attention away from her retreating back with a desperate, deliberate bravery that Kate recognized, with a fresh stab of horror, as exactly the kind of sacrifice she had spent years overseas trying and often failing to prevent. She reached the generator room entrance just as Mike finished setting the ignition device deep among the stacked fuel reserves, his hands shaking but his movements precise despite the terror plainly written across his face. "It is set," he shouted. 60-second delay, we need to move right now." Behind them, Dozer's gunfire had gone silent. Kate did not let herself process what that silence might mean, not yet, not with 60 seconds ticking down and an emergency hatch still to reach on the far side of the generator room. She grabbed Mike by the arm and hauled him toward the hatch, both of them running full out across the cramped space between towering fuel containers, and it was in that desperate sprint that the creature finally forced its way through the generator room's main entrance behind them, having apparently finished whatever it had been doing to Dozer Franklin in the corridor beyond. Kate did not look back. She could not afford to. She kept her eyes fixed on the emergency hatch ahead, kept her legs moving despite the burning exhaustion in every muscle, and beside her, Mike matched her pace with a desperation that told her he understood, exactly as clearly as she did, what would happen if they did not clear this room in time. They reached the hatch with the countdown, by Kate's rough internal estimate, somewhere under 20 seconds remaining, and Mike wrenched it open with strength born entirely of terror, shoving Kate through ahead of him before scrambling through himself, both of them tumbling into the corridor beyond in a tangle of limbs. "Seal it," Kate gasped, and together they hauled the heavy hatch closed and spun the manual locking wheel with hands that would not stop shaking. The explosion, when it came, shook the entire station with a violence that knocked both of them flat to the corridor floor. A deep concussive roar followed immediately by a wave of heat that Kate felt even through the sealed hatch and several meters of separating corridor. Alarms blared through the facility's remaining functional systems, and somewhere beneath the chaos, for one brief, terrible, hopeful moment, Kate thought she heard the creature's roar cut short. The hope did not last. They made their way back toward the central module through corridors now filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel, station emergency systems fighting valiantly to contain fires that the massive explosion had ignited in several connected sections of the facility. Kate kept expecting, with every step, to round a corner and find the creature's charred remains, some final confirmation that Mike's plan had actually worked, that Dozer's sacrifice and the terrible risk they had all just taken had actually purchased them the victory they so desperately needed. Instead, halfway back to the central module, they heard it again, that same low resonant roar, weaker now, unmistakably wounded, but very much alive, echoing through the smoke-filled corridors from somewhere behind them. "It survived," Mike said, his voice hollow with a despair that matched exactly what Kate felt building in her own chest. "We blew half the station's fuel reserves and it still survived." "Wounded," Kate said, forcing herself to focus on the one piece of good news buried in the terrible confirmation. "It sounds wounded, meh. That is not nothing. That might be exactly the opening we need." They pushed forward through the smoke, reaching the central module's reinforced door and pounding against it until Commander Ashworth's voice called back, confirming their identity before the door finally opened to let them through. The relief on the survivors' faces at seeing Kate and Mike return alive was immediately tempered by the grim reality of Dozer's absence, and Kate found herself unable to meet anyone's eyes as she delivered the news of his sacrifice, the words feeling inadequate against the enormity of what he had done for them. "It is hurt," she added, once the immediate grief had settled enough for practical planning to resume. "Badly hurt from the sound of it. That changes our options. We do not have to kill it outright. We just have to survive long enough for it to either finish dying or retreat back to wherever it came from." Commander Ashworth pulled up the station's emergency communications panel, checking the status of their satellite uplink with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and grief he still had not had a proper moment to feel. I have already put out an emergency distress call to every station and vessel within range, he told the assembled survivors. Nearest response capability is a research vessel currently about 18 hours out, plus whatever military assets get scrambled once this makes it up the chain of command properly. We just need to hold this position for 18 hours. 18 hours, spoken aloud in the wreckage of everything Halcyon Station had been only a day earlier, felt like an impossible span of time to Kate, and she could see the same grim calculation reflected on every exhausted, terrified face around her. But impossible or not, it was the only plan they had left, and she set about doing what she had always done best in situations like this, organizing the practical business of survival into manageable pieces that people could actually focus on rather than collapsing entirely under the weight of everything they had already lost. She assigned watch rotations, ensured the wounded were as stable as her limited supplies allowed, and worked with Priya to reinforce the central module's remaining vulnerable points using whatever materials the survivors could gather from the immediate area. The work gave everyone something to focus on besides grief and terror, and Kate recognized in herself the same old coping mechanism that had carried her through years overseas, the deliberate, disciplined focus on the next necessary task rather than the overwhelming totality of the disaster surrounding her. Sarah Chin, once she had recovered enough from her own shock to be useful, approached Kate quietly during a lull in the preparations. "You keep doing that," she said. "Keep pulling everyone back together every time it feels like we are about to fall apart completely." "How?" "Practice," Kate said simply, and left it at that, because the full answer was longer and darker than she had any energy left to share. The creature's attacks against the central module resumed roughly 2 hours later, weaker now but still terrifyingly capable, testing the reinforced barriers the survivors had built with a persistence that suggested, despite its injuries, it had no intention of simply retreating and leaving its prey unfinished. Kate rotated through watch shifts alongside the handful of remaining armed personnel, tracking the creature's movements through the muffled sounds that carried from the corridors beyond, trying to build some sense of its patterns, its habits, anything that might give the survivors an edge during the long hours still stretching out ahead of them. It was during one of these watches, deep in the artificial night of the Antarctic winter darkness pressing against the station's remaining windows, that Kate began to notice something in the creature's behavior that struck her as significant. Its attacks, though still forceful, had grown noticeably less frequent, longer gaps of silence stretching between each assault, and when it did attack, its movements, audible even through the reinforced walls, carried a labored quality that had not been present during the initial breach. She reported this observation to Commander Ashworth during a brief planning session, and he listened with the careful attention of a man desperate for any sliver of good news. "You think the explosion is actually catching up to it? Delayed effect from the burns, maybe internal damage we cannot see." "I think," Kate said carefully, unwilling to promise more hope than the situation actually warranted, "that whatever kind of biology that thing has, it is not infinite. It got hurt badly in that explosion, and now it is running out of whatever reserves let it keep functioning this long afterward. I do not know how much longer that process takes. But I do not think it can keep this up forever." Ashworth nodded slowly, some of the crushing weight on his shoulders easing fractionally at the possibility, however uncertain, that survival might genuinely be within their reach rather than merely a desperate hope they were all pretending to believe in. The lull did not last. 3 hours before the research vessel's estimated arrival, the creature launched what would prove to be its most sustained and violent assault yet, throwing itself against the central module's reinforced barriers with a renewed, almost desperate fury that suggested it understood, in whatever way its alien mind processed the world, that time was working against it as surely as it was working against the survivors trapped inside. A section of reinforced wall near the module's rear finally gave way under the repeated impacts, and the creature forced its way through the breach before the defenders could properly organize a response, its massive form filling the narrow gap with a horrible, unstoppable momentum. A young engineer named Carl Whitfield, positioned nearest the breach, did not have time to retreat before one of the creature's limbs caught him, and Kate watched, helpless across the crowded module, as he was gone in a spray of blood before anyone could reach him. "Fall back to the secondary position," Ashworth screamed over the chaos, and the survivors scrambled toward a smaller, more defensible section of the module that Priya's reinforcement work had prepared as exactly this kind of last resort fallback. Kate found herself near the rear of the retreating group, covering the withdrawal alongside the last two armed survivors, firing controlled bursts at the creature's exposed joints in the desperate hope of buying enough time for everyone else to reach safety. The creature, weakened but still ferociously dangerous, pressed forward through the smoke and chaos, and for one terrible moment, Kate believed with a cold, sinking certainty that this was the moment the entire station's remaining survivors would finally be overrun. Then Priya, from somewhere near the secondary position, through the improvised device she had spent the last 2 hours assembling from salvaged components, a crude incendiary charge that detonated against the creature's flank with a burst of flame and heat that finally, unmistakably, drove it backward with a shriek of genuine pain. The creature retreated through the breach it had created, dragging itself back into the smoke-filled corridors beyond with a labored, uneven gait that told Kate its injuries had finally caught up to it in a way that mattered. The survivors did not celebrate. There was no room left in any of them for celebration, not with Carl Whitfield's body lying in the wreckage of the breached wall, not with the growing list of names that had been checked off against the missing over the preceding hours. Kate did the count again, forcing herself through the grim arithmetic because someone needed to, because Commander Ashworth's hands had begun shaking too badly for him to manage it himself. Of the 32 people who had called Halcyon Station home before the drill struck that ancient black surface 200 meters beneath the ice, 16 remained gathered in the secondary fallback position. 16 out of 32, exactly half, a number that settled into Kate's chest with a weight she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. "We hold here," Ashworth said finally, his voice hoarse but steady, forcing himself back into the role his position demanded even through obvious exhaustion and grief. "Reinforce this position as best we can with what we have left. The ship is still coming. We just need to survive until it gets here." Priya, her hands still trembling from the aftermath of throwing the incendiary charge, looked up at Kate with an expression that mixed exhaustion with a fragile, hard-won hope. That thing felt real pain back there. Real, honest-to-God pain. Whatever mythology built up around it before, whatever ancient civilization thought they were dealing with when they sealed it in that pyramid in the first place, it bleeds. It burns. It can be hurt. "It can be hurt," Kate agreed quietly. "That does not mean we are done fighting it yet." The following hours passed in a tense, exhausted rhythm of watch shifts and hurried repairs, the survivors working with a grim, focused efficiency born of having nothing left to lose and everything still to protect. The creature did not attack again immediately, and Kate found herself, during the long silent stretches, turning over everything they had learned about it, searching for any pattern that might give them a clearer advantage should it return for a final assault before the rescue ship's arrival. Sarah Chen, recovering slowly from her earlier shock, pulled Kate aside during one of these quiet stretches, her scientist's mind clearly working through something that had been troubling her since the pyramid's interior. "I keep thinking about that chamber," she said quietly. "About how the sarcophagus was positioned. How the whole structure seemed built specifically around protecting whatever was inside it." "You think somebody put it there on purpose?" Kate said. "Sealed it away deliberately." "I think," Sarah said, "that whoever built that pyramid was not worshipping this thing. I think they were containing it. The patterns on the walls, the scale of the structure, all of it reads more like a prison than a temple, at least to my eye. Something ancient enough to have been sealed away before human civilization as we understand it even existed, and somebody, or something, judged it dangerous enough to bury it under 3 kilometers of ice rather than simply destroy it." Kate absorbed that thought with a growing unease that settled uncomfortably alongside everything else weighing on her. If that is true, then whoever built that prison did not fully trust their ability to kill it either. They just wanted it contained, buried deep enough that nothing would ever disturb it again. "And then we drilled straight down and knocked on the door," Sarah said, her voice carrying a bitter, exhausted edge. "I keep thinking about that. About how much of this is on us, on me, for pushing so hard to reach that depth." Kate did not have anything comforting to offer her on that point, because some old, hard part of her privately agreed. 12 hours into the 18-hour wait for rescue, the creature returned for what would prove to be its final assault on the surviving crew, though nobody trapped inside that reinforced module had any way of knowing as the attack began that it would also be its last. Kate heard it first, a low, dragging scrape moving through the corridors beyond their position, slower now, more labored than any of the earlier assaults, but unmistakably, terrifyingly, still coming. Positions, Commander Ashworth called out, and the remaining armed survivors moved into the defensive formation they had spent the preceding hours rehearsing, weapons and improvised incendiary devices ready, every person in that crowded space understanding with grim clarity that this confrontation would likely determine, one way or another, whether any of them lived to see the rescue ship's arrival. The creature breached the position's outer barrier with far less force than its previous assaults, a fact Kate noted with a cautious, guarded hope even as adrenaline flooded her system in preparation for whatever came next. It moved into the confined space slower than before, one of its limbs dragging visibly, its chitinous plating scorched black along one entire flank from Priya's earlier incendiary charge, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Kate looked at the creature and saw, unmistakably, something dying rather than something invincible. "Now," Ashworth shouted, and the defenders opened fire in a coordinated volley aimed specifically at the creature's exposed, burned flank, the concentrated damage finally, definitively breaking through whatever remained of its natural armor in that weakened section. The creature shrieked, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the station, and staggered backward, and Priya, seizing the opening with a courage Kate would remember for the rest of her life, hurled her final incendiary charge directly into the wound the gunfire had opened. The explosion that followed was smaller than the one that had destroyed the generator room, but positioned exactly where it needed to be, tearing through flesh and whatever passed for the creature's vital organs with a violence that finally, mercifully, brought the long nightmare to its end. The creature collapsed in the confined space, its massive form convulsing once, twice, and then going still in a way that Kate, with her years of medical training, recognized immediately and unmistakably as death. Nobody moved for a long moment. Nobody quite believed it was actually over. "Is it?" Sarah finally whispered into the tense silence, unable to finish the question. Kate moved forward carefully, weapon still raised, and pressed 2 fingers against the exposed, scorched flesh where the creature's neck met its massive, alien skull, though she had no real medical reference point for what she was even checking for. There was no pulse she could detect, no rise and fall of breath, no movement of any kind beyond the last residual twitching of nerve tissue finally shutting down. "It is dead," she said finally, her own voice sounding strange and distant in her ears. "It is actually dead." The reaction that swept through the surviving crew was not the triumphant celebration Kate might have imagined, months earlier, that a moment like this would produce. Instead it came as something quieter, more fractured, exhausted relief tangled inextricably with grief for everyone who had not survived to see this moment, 16 names now permanently absent from the crew roster that had numbered 32 only a day earlier. Commander Ashworth sank slowly to the floor beside the creature's massive corpse, his composure finally, completely breaking after hours of forcing himself to hold the survivors together through sheer will alone, and Kate found herself moving to sit beside him, offering the same quiet, steady presence she had once offered to soldiers in far worse places than this, because some things, she understood now, never really stopped being her job, no matter how far she ran to try to escape them. The rescue vessel arrived 6 hours later. Its crew met at the damaged, blood-streaked entrance of Halcyon Station by 16 exhausted, traumatized survivors who had spent the intervening hours doing what little they could to secure the facility and account, as thoroughly as circumstances allowed, for the dead. Kate helped coordinate the evacuation with the same disciplined focus that had carried her through the entire ordeal, though underneath that focus, she felt something in herself finally beginning to crack now that the immediate danger had passed. The vessel's medical team took over triage duties from her within the first hour, and Kate found herself, for the first time in nearly 24 hours, without an immediate task demanding her full attention, and the absence of that task left her standing alone near the vessel's railing, staring back at the shrinking shape of Halcyon Station as they pulled away from the ice, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. Sarah Chen found her there some time later, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her own eyes red-rimmed from grief and exhaustion in equal measure. They are already talking about a full military and scientific expedition back to that pyramid, she said quietly. Once they have secured the structure, contained it properly. There is apparently a great deal of interest in understanding exactly what we found down there. Kate did not answer immediately, watching the gray Antarctic horizon swallow the last visible outline of the station behind them. Did you tell them what you told me? About it being a prison, not a temple? I told them, Sarah said. I am not sure it changed anything about their enthusiasm for going back down there. Kate closed her eyes, thinking of that vast interior chamber, of the shattered sarcophagus, of Sarah's theory that whoever built that structure had judged the creature dangerous enough to require burial under 3 kilometers of ancient ice rather than simple destruction, and found herself wondering, with a cold unease that would follow her long after this voyage ended, exactly how many more sarcophagi that vast chamber might actually contain. The military debriefings began almost immediately upon the survivors' arrival at a support base in Christchurch, New Zealand, a process that stretched across nearly 2 weeks of careful, exhaustive questioning conducted by officials who introduced themselves with titles that told Kate very little about which actual agencies they represented. She answered every question as honestly and completely as her memory allowed, describing the pyramid, the creature, the desperate hours of the siege, and the eventual, costly victory that had allowed 16 of them to walk away alive. She noticed, over the course of those debriefings, a particular pattern in the questions the officials kept returning to: less interest in the human cost of what had happened and more interest, again and again, in the precise dimensions of that interior chamber, in Sarah's theory about the sarcophagus's purpose, in whether the survivors had seen any indication of additional structures or containers within the pyramid's full extent, which nobody had been able to properly survey before the disaster began. You think they are already planning to go back, Mike Torres said to her quietly one evening, the two of them sharing a rare quiet meal together in the support base's mess hall, the first real meal either of them had managed to keep down in days. Not to study it carefully this time. To claim it. Weaponize whatever they can learn from it. I think, Kate said carefully, choosing her words the way she had learned to choose them around people whose intentions she could not fully verify, that whatever they decide to do, it is not really going to be up to people like us anymore. We did our part. We survived. What happens to that pyramid next is somebody else's decision now. Mike did not look reassured by that answer, and Kate could not blame him, because she did not find much reassurance in it herself either. The official report on the Halcyon Station incident, once it was finally released in a heavily redacted form months later, attributed the 16 deaths to what it carefully termed a catastrophic geological event combined with a subsequent facility fire, language so far removed from the actual horror of what had happened that Kate found herself laughing bitterly the first time she read it, a short, humorless sound that startled her with its own bleakness. She had expected, on some level, that the truth would never be allowed to reach the wider public in any form resembling what she had actually lived through. She had seen enough, during her years overseas, to understand exactly how these things tended to be handled by people whose job it was to manage information rather than honor it. Still, seeing it in print, seeing Dozer Franklin's death and Carl Whitfield's and Tobias Lund's, and 13 others reduced to a single bloodless phrase about a geological event, sat wrong in her chest in a way she suspected would never fully settle. She reached out to the families of those who had died where she was able to, sharing what small true details the ongoing classification restrictions actually allowed her to share, sitting with grieving parents and spouses and trying to offer them something more honest than the official report, even if she could not offer them everything. It was slow, painful work, and it did not undo any of what had happened, but it felt, to Kate, like the only meaningful thing left within her power to do. Commander Ashworth, she learned through occasional contact in the months that followed, had submitted his resignation from any further Antarctic postings almost immediately upon returning to more temperate ground, a decision Kate understood completely and did not judge him for in the slightest. Kate herself received an offer, roughly 4 months after the incident, to join a newly formed advisory team attached to whatever classified program had inherited jurisdiction over the sealed pyramid and the broader implications of what had been found beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet. The offer came with a substantial salary increase, extensive benefits, and a level of access to information about the ongoing situation that no outside civilian would ever be permitted to see. She turned it down without much hesitation, a decision that surprised the recruiting officer more than it surprised Kate herself, who had spent the intervening months slowly, carefully rebuilding the quiet, ordinary life she had originally sought when she first left the Marines. She had gone back to that quiet life changed, carrying fresh weight alongside the old weight she had never fully set down, but she had gone back to it nonetheless, taking a position at a small clinic in a coastal town far from any ice sheet, treating ordinary injuries and illnesses for people who would never need to know exactly what she had survived to arrive there. She still thought about the pyramid often, more often than she would have liked to admit to anyone who asked. She thought about Sarah's theory, about ancient builders who had judged something so dangerous that burial seemed safer than destruction, and she thought, with a persistent unease she could never quite shake, about how casually modern ambition had disturbed a seal that had held for 100,000 years, and how easily, given enough time and enough curiosity, someone might eventually decide to disturb it again. She kept a small folded photograph in her wallet, one of the few personal effects recovered from Halcyon Station after the incident, a group photo taken during her first week at the station, showing faces that were mostly gone now, smiling in the bright, endless light of the brief Antarctic summer, none of them yet aware of what waited for them far below the ice. 2 years passed. Ordinary in the way that time tends to smooth even the sharpest trauma into something a person can eventually carry without being crushed beneath its full weight every single day. Kate built a quiet life in her coastal town, found a slow, careful kind of peace in work that asked nothing more of her than treating one patient at a time, and mostly, on most days, managed to keep the memory of that pyramid and everything that had happened beneath it filed away in whatever part of her mind she had learned to keep such things filed. Mostly. Not entirely. She received a call one evening from a number she did not recognize, and the voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Chin, whom Kate had not spoken with directly in over a year, the two of them having drifted apart in the careful, deliberate way survivors of shared trauma sometimes do, each needing distance from anything that reminded them too directly of what they had lived through together. "I should not be calling you," Sarah said without preamble, her voice tight with a fear Kate recognized immediately, a fear that pulled her instantly back into the old, sharpened alertness she had worked so hard to set aside. "I am not supposed to have this information anymore. I am not even supposed to still be in contact with the program at all. But I still have a friend inside, and she reached out to me today because she did not know who else to tell." "Tell me what?" Kate said, already feeling the quiet peace of the last 2 years beginning to crack beneath her. "They went back down," Sarah said. 8 months ago. Full military expedition, fully contained, fully classified. They found additional chambers deeper in the structure. More sarcophagi, Kate. A lot more than just the one we found. "How many?" Kate asked, though some part of her already dreaded the answer before Sarah gave it. My contact would not say exactly. But she used the word extensive. She said the deeper chambers extend for kilometers beyond the initial structure we found, an entire network built around dozens, maybe hundreds of individual containment units, each one apparently holding something similar to what we encountered. Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the last few words. "They have kept everything fully sealed and secured since the discovery. No further incidents reported. But Kate, they are studying it. Actively studying it, trying to understand the biology, trying to understand whatever ancient civilization built that containment system in the first place." Kate closed her eyes, picturing that vast interior chamber all over again, the shattered sarcophagus, the moving patterns along the walls that had seemed, even then, to suggest a scale and purpose far beyond what any of them had initially understood. "They are not going to leave it alone," she said quietly. "Are they?" "No," Sarah agreed. "I do not think they ever were going to." The call ended a few minutes later, Sarah apologizing again for reaching out, for pulling Kate back into something she had worked so hard to leave behind, and Kate assured her, with more calm than she actually felt, that she understood, that she was glad Sarah had told her regardless of the risk involved in doing so. She sat alone in her quiet coastal house for a long time after hanging up the phone, staring out at the dark ocean beyond her window, and found herself thinking, for the first time in months, about that photograph still folded in her wallet, about 16 names that would never be properly honored in any public record, and about the terrible, patient scale of whatever still waited, sealed but not destroyed, deep beneath the Antarctic ice. She did not sleep well that night, or for many nights afterward, the old careful peace she had built over 2 years now permanently shadowed by the knowledge Sarah had shared with her. She found herself, in the following weeks, quietly researching whatever fragments of information she could find through legitimate public channels, most of it heavily filtered and largely useless, official statements about continued scientific research in West Antarctica that gave away nothing of the true scale Sarah had described. She thought often about reaching out again to some of the other survivors, to Mike Torres, to Commander Ashworth, wondering whether they too had received similar warnings, whether the quiet lives they had all worked so hard to rebuild were similarly shadowed now by the same unwelcome knowledge. She resisted the urge, telling herself there was little practical benefit in spreading anxiety that none of them had any real power to act upon, though the resistance cost her something every time she set the impulse aside. The advisory position she had turned down 2 years earlier crossed her mind more than once during those difficult weeks, and she found herself, uncomfortably, reconsidering the decision in ways she had not expected to. If the program was truly moving forward with active study of whatever vast network lay beneath that ice sheet, someone with real understanding of exactly how badly that first encounter had gone might actually serve some meaningful purpose inside that process, might catch a warning sign or push back against a dangerous decision in a way that could genuinely matter. She did not act on the impulse immediately, but she did not fully set it aside either, and some quiet, unresolved part of her understood that the door back into that world, the one she had worked so hard to close behind her, had perhaps never actually been as fully shut as she had allowed herself to believe. 6 months after Sarah's call, Kate received a second, more official contact, a formal letter this time rather than a hushed phone call, inviting her once again to consider the advisory position she had originally declined, the language carefully neutral but the timing, given everything she now understood, impossible to read as coincidence. She sat with the letter for nearly a week before finally making her decision, weighing the quiet peace of her coastal life against the persistent, gnawing unease that had never fully left her since Sarah's warning. In the end, it was the 16 names she still carried, and the countless names Sarah's contact had suggested might eventually join them if the program's ambitions were allowed to proceed unchecked and unquestioned, that finally tipped the balance. Kate had spent years overseas failing in ways both large and small to save everyone she was responsible for, and she had spent the years since telling herself that stepping away from all future responsibility was the only way to finally stop failing anyone else. She understood now, sitting alone with that letter in her quiet coastal house, that stepping away had never actually been the same thing as staying safe, not really, not when the thing she was stepping away from was still down there, patient and vast and largely misunderstood, waiting for someone with enough ambition and not enough caution to disturb it again. She accepted the position 2 weeks later, packing the small folded photograph from Halcyon Station carefully into her bag alongside everything else, and did not allow herself to think too hard about whether she was walking back toward exactly the kind of danger she had once sworn to leave behind forever, or whether, after everything she had survived, this was simply the only kind of life left that still made any sense to her at all. She arrived at the new facility 3 weeks later, a heavily secured research base built specifically to support the expanded excavation effort, situated a careful distance from the original site of Halcyon Station, which had been permanently decommissioned following the incident and now stood empty and abandoned above the ice, a hollow monument to everything that had been lost there. Kate did not visit the old station site during her orientation, though she found her eyes drawn toward its distant, barely visible shape more than once during the long flight in, unable to fully look away from the place where so much had ended, and so much, apparently, was only just beginning again. The scale of the new operation exceeded even what Sarah's warning had prepared her for, a small city's worth of personnel and equipment dedicated entirely to the careful, methodical excavation of a structure that, according to the briefings Kate received during her first week, extended across an area of ice sheet larger than most small countries. The individual containment chambers Sarah had described numbered, according to the latest survey data, well over 200, each one presumed to hold something similar to what had killed 16 people at Halcyon Station, though so far, mercifully, every additional chamber examined had remained fully sealed and dormant. Kate settled into her advisory role with the same careful, disciplined focus that had carried her through every difficult chapter of her life since leaving the Marines, reviewing safety protocols, pushing back where she judged the program's ambitions were outpacing its caution, doing whatever small, meaningful work remained within her power to do. She did not know whether it would be enough. She did not know whether anything she contributed here would ultimately matter against the sheer, patient scale of what lay sealed beneath this ice sheet. But she had learned, over the hardest years of her life, that matching was never guaranteed, and that a person kept doing the work regardless, because the alternative, walking away entirely and leaving the outcome to people who had never stood in that pyramid's shattered chamber and felt its ancient hunger firsthand, felt like a far greater failure than anything else she could imagine. On quiet nights at the new facility, when the endless Antarctic dark pressed close against the reinforced windows and most of the base slept through the long polar winter, Kate sometimes found herself standing alone at the edge of the primary excavation site, looking down into the vast illuminated shaft that now extended far deeper into the ice than anything Mike Torres's original drill had ever reached, toward chambers that stretched out beneath her feet in numbers still not fully counted. She thought, on those nights, about ancient builders who had judged this thing dangerous enough to bury under 3 kilometers of ice rather than risk destroying it outright, and she wondered, as she had wondered many times since Sarah's warning first reached her, what exactly those ancient builders had known that modern ambitions still refused to fully respect. She thought about 10,000 generations that had lived and died on the surface far above this hollow, patient darkness, never knowing what slept beneath their feet, and she thought about how thin, in the end, the barrier between that ignorance and disaster had actually turned out to be. The excavation continued below her, careful and methodical, watched over now by protocols built from the hardest lessons Halcyon Station had ever taught, protocols Kate herself had helped design, and she told herself, standing there in the endless dark, that this time would be different, that this time the caution would hold where it had failed before. Somewhere far below, in chambers that had not yet been opened, in a darkness that had waited 100,000 years already and seemed entirely prepared to wait longer still, something ancient and vast and patient continued its long, silent sleep, and Kate Reyes stood watch above it, carrying 16 names and a folded photograph and a promise to herself that she intended, this time, to keep. The ice held its secrets a while longer, but it did not hold them forever. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'll see you in the next one.